Hi, my name is Galvin. I'm from the Ateneo Salt Institute, and I currently teach in the Education Department and in the Communications Department. Thank you very much for inviting me to share with you some things today. The title of my presentation is How to Ace Designing for Learning. Later on, hopefully, ACE will make a little more sense to you. But for now, I guess what's most important to know is that my focus will be on thinking about how to design distance and online learning and how to design it with learning in mind. So I'd like to just do a quick throwback. Much like a lot of you in Ateneo, of course, COVID caught us by surprise. We had to shift to online learning suddenly. And so if you look at my screen here, this is a snapshot, a literal snapshot of the many things that happened in the beginning. So there was a scammer for getting people on board. There was a scammer for training teachers on this and that. So when we look at the internet, for example, in the beginning, 5 or 6 months ago, when all of these things started, one of the things that might describe what the internet looked like and what it felt like was maybe something like this, no? Like I think this picture over here depicted or depicts what we felt like back then. That there were so many things that we can do. There were so many challenges, so many things to figure out, and to a certain extent, to be honest, it's been quite overwhelming, no? Trying to answer all of these questions, most especially trying to answer questions that we're not so sure of. So what we did back then was to try to reflect on what online and distance learning uh, would probably feel like for students, or for those who were able to try it out in the sudden shift. If you remember last school year, there was the sudden shift wherein schools needed to just go online. And Ateneo was one of them. We spent a few weeks trying to do some sort of remote teaching as we needed to shift to an online mode. No? So we stopped and thought about what this means for students and what this feels like for students. When we look online, we'll probably see these memes, no? And these memes, although of course not intending to give concrete research-based feedback, um, these memes begin to depict what people feel about online learning. That, for example, here, online class, please turn off your phone. Di ba? Parang a loss of power of the teacher, a loss of control. The meme in the middle, online learning, talks about the uncertainty of learning. Like, will students really learn online? Is this really effective? Uh, and the third meme over here talks about the challenge of online learning. That will it be easier? Will it be harder? So a lot of these different things that we need to think about, or that we needed to consider in online learning. And again, the challenge was there was a lot. No? There was a lot to digest, a lot to think about, a lot to learn about. So what we did was we thought about what would be the biggest challenge, or what would be the most common challenge across classrooms. And I think that when we look at literature on distance learning, one of the things that the literature will always remind us of is that one of the biggest challenge is this, no? The mere absence of the teacher, because of the physical distance that we have in distance and online learning. So we thought that this might be a worthwhile thing to really embark on, to try to ask ourselves, so what do we do about this? How do we override this absence of the teacher? So our driving question was this, no? So how might we design for teaching presence? That if the teacher cannot be physically present with the students, how might we design for that presence to still be felt by the students? And one of the ways by which we try to answer this question is through what we call ACE. Uh, I'll show you a short video in the next slide, just so you get a glimpse of what we mean by ACE.
Designing for online learning. With a sudden shift to online learning, the student's experience with education has dramatically changed. The classroom is now their bedroom, their living room, dining room, or even their garage. Attending classes is now watching a video, reading an article, or going through a list of links and resources. The class schedule is now a list of tasks and deadlines. What is in common about these many changes? The absence of a teacher. But should the teacher really be absent? As teachers, we shouldn't leave learning to chance. It should be designed. One way we teachers should still be present is through careful and thoughtful design. Here are 3 things to help you ace that design. Activate from context. Design activities that provide opportunities for learners to activate relevant context. This could be prior knowledge, prior experience, or even anything from their current situation. Ask a question, provide a prompt, or give them a task that will help surface anything that can be related to the topic at hand. This primes them for the next step. Connect to content. Designing an online class doesn't just mean presenting content. Instead of just presenting content, think about connecting to content. Think about how to connect the content to relevant examples, to interesting metaphors, to intriguing situations. Ultimately, this helps learners connect the content to themselves. Evaluate to validate. Finally, empowering learning experiences are those that also provide opportunities for practice and application. Think of these as milestones or pins in a map, so learners themselves can know where they are. Make sure to provide feedback so you can help them validate what has changed through this learning experience. So, should the teacher really be absent in an online course? On the contrary, through effective design of the online class, the teacher should be more present than ever. How about you? How would you design your teaching presence into your online classroom?
So I hope that the video gave you a good idea about what we mean by these 3 things: activate from context, connect to content, and evaluate to validate. I think the goal of thinking about these 3 key phrases is to try to synthesize what we've seen in literature and what we know from our experience as educators, and to try to identify what are the basic things that we hope should be present in any good and effective online or distance learning scenario. So since you already saw the video, and I think the video clearly explains what each one is, I'd like to spend the last few minutes sharing with you some examples. I think that at this point, one of the advantages of having sessions like this is that we can now draw from our examples. No? So I've gone on, I think, at least 2 semesters of teaching online, and I'd like to share with you some of the insights that I learned about each of these 3 things as I try to do it in my own personal classroom. So I'll begin with activate from context. So what are some insights that I've gained so far about activating from context? You'll notice that as I go through my sharing, you'll hear some familiar words now, because I think that when we look at ACE, when you look at these 3 things, it's really for me going back to basics. No? So, and one of the basic things is to ask this question: what do students bring with them? That to acknowledge that in any learning scenario, even in an online learning scenario, students bring with them something. And one thing that we acknowledge that they bring with them is prior experience, no? Prior experience or their current experience. So how have I taken this into my teaching? In the module that I'm teaching right now, one of the things that I tried doing was this. So I know that my students, I teach second-year students right now. So they've been in Ateneo for at least a year. And I know that one of the things that they miss is the campus. No? So in one of our exercises, so I teach a course on creativity and problem awareness. And in this particular lesson, I'm preparing them to learn about a concept called mental locks. No? And one of the mental locks for creativity is our notion of not always wanting to use our imagination because it's not practical. The things that we imagine are not practical. So as a prelection exercise, one of the things I ask them to do is to listen to this podcast from Ateneo Wild. So Ateneo Wild is an organization in the school that records sounds throughout the school. So I ask them to close their eyes, listen to these sounds, and then imagine themselves there. You know? So draw it, and I did that as a teacher because I knew that their current experience might be calling for this, no? That they miss the school, they've been stuck at home for the past 5 or 6 months, and this might be a way for me to draw them into the lesson, no? So to connect the experience. Uh, Here's another example. This is a Padlet wall exercise I did for this module this semester. Um, this is on my unit on design thinking and empathy. And one of the initial exercises I asked them to do is to think about a gift giving or gift receiving experience. And I have them post pictures of gifts that they've received before, or gifts that they've given, and what are the hits and misses. No? So drawing from experience, not just the current experience, but their past experiences as well, asking questions like, how is the lesson today connected to something that my students have experienced before or are currently experiencing? So I found that when I begin to do this, or when I start my modules with this, they're able to connect to the presentation or the content a little more. So when we talk about activating from context, it's also about activating from prior knowledge. And again, I know that a lot of you here are educators, so this is probably not new to you. But in online learning, there might be a tendency to just to just give a couple of different things for students to look at, watch, read, and do. You know? So a lot of the basic things that we actually do in a face-to-face classroom are now given premium importance. Things like, for example, here, transition statements, no, in this particular screenshot, that as I move from one part of the module to another, I really make it a point to refer back to the previous thing, most especially if the previous part was lengthy. So for example, if I planned for them to do a 1 hour module prior to this part, I'll make it a point that when they get to the second part, I always try to refer to the first part. Again, very obvious things, but I think we need to remind ourselves and check and make sure that these things are present in our modules, whether written, online, or whatever modality you're in. Another strategy that I've been doing in terms of connecting to prior knowledge is to make sure that my modules begin with a module overview. So if you can see in my screenshot, in the lower part, you see there in blue, part 1, part 2, part 3. No? So usually in my modules, I divide it into several parts. And even before they get to the parts, I give them an overview of how the parts are connected. No? So I think this is very much about connecting to prior knowledge, so that when they move from one part to another, they see the connection of the parts. They're not just a bunch of things that you ask them to do, just a list of things to do. Another practice that I've been doing in my modules is to always end with something like this, no? Summarizing some key ideas in 2 to 3 sentences or 2 to 3 statements. Uh, in fact, in one of our exit tickets, and I'll talk about exit tickets later on, one of my students actually shared that this was really helpful for her because when she read through the statements, she usually would pause and she would usually reflect on her understanding of the statements. And if there's a statement that she doesn't understand clearly, she will go back to the materials to review. No? So I think that providing a summary is an important part of this whole module designing process, most especially in asynchronous learning situations. And finally, um, when we talk about activating from context, I think it's important to continue to activate from context. The previous examples are activities that you design prior to maybe giving students access to a module, whether in print, online, in whatever format. But I found it important to continue to activate from context and to continue to look at what context looks like. No? So for example, in the screenshot here, this is the gradebook of Canvas, the learning management system we're using. And one of the things I like doing is just looking at the overview of the gradebook and looking at submissions, looking if there is a student who has not submitted anything. So for example, here, the row I highlighted here is of an actual student who has not submitted anything. And so when we look at the data, this prompts us to check on the students. And I think that's what's more important. Not necessarily to reprimand a student like this, but to really find out what's happening. No? And I think this is what I like about online learning, the ability to actually see student participation and student contribution, and to be able to spot specific students who might need catching up, who might need prompting, or at the very least, who might need to be asked, no? Kamusta ka na? What's happening? What's your situation? How can I help you? So that's the first part, activating from context. The second tip is to connect to content. Again, allow me to share with you some examples. So what do we mean by connecting to content? The first idea about connecting to content, I think, is to converse, not to inform. Um, it's very tempting, most especially in online learning, to just dump content, right? Watch this video, read this article, so on and so forth. No? Or just to simply copy paste text, or to simply just write down all of the information for students to read. But what research is telling us, this is from Moreno and Mayer, what research is telling us is that how we write the text, or how we actually say the content, actually matters. So for example, here in the screenshot, I don't know if you can see it, it's a little small, but allow me to read it. So if we compare these two statements, a formal way of writing might sound like this. This program is about what type of plants survive on different planets. For each planet, a plant will be designed, so on and so forth. As compared to writing it in a more personalized fashion, which might sound like this. You are about to start a journey where you will be visiting different planets. For each planet, you will need to design a plant. So just by listening to and comparing those two things, most probably you would feel more comfortable listening to the latter than the former. And research confirms this. No? So in the research of Moreno and Mayer, when they analyzed courses, text in courses, that wrote things in a more personalized fashion as compared to writing it in a more formal fashion, um, and they tested students to check their acquisition of knowledge. What they found out is that students who used courses that wrote in a more personalized fashion actually learned more. So a specific strategy here is to use more of the words you, we, and our. No? So if you just force yourself in your writing of the modules, or in your explaining in a video presentation like this, to use these words more, then it pushes you naturally to converse with your students rather than just to inform them. And again, this might feel like semantics to a lot, but what research is saying is that this matters. No? And in fact, even in my experience of teaching online so far, students have complimented the language that I use in my courses, saying that it's been easy for them to go through the course because of this. Another angle to look at when talking about conversing, not just informing, is to bring your teacher voice into the picture. So one of the things that I like doing in a face-to-face scenario is to show pictures of Asher, my 3-year-old son. And I would usually relate scenes that I remember from interacting with him to the lesson of the day. So I continue to do that. I continue to do that in all of my classes, in fact. And again, it's interesting that my students at the end of the course, last intersession, for example, did mention that they liked Asher being mentioned in different parts of the module. No? It made the module more personal. No? And I think that's one of the things that we lose out on, no? That the way we teachers bring our personality into our teaching. And I think that's important because I'd like to think that this is still the kind of teaching we want. No, we don't want teaching to be robotic or really just feel like a series of Wikipedia pages. So we want teaching to be a conversation between the teacher and the student, and later on, as I will emphasize, among students as well. What does it mean to connect to content? Another way is to create opportunities to reflect and extend. That when you present content, hopefully it's not just about them being able to read something or watch something, but hopefully you create opportunities to process whatever it is that you're asking them to read, watch, or listen to. So what we've done in the SALT Institute is to come up with prompts, and this has been helpful for me personally as a teacher. So for example, one prompt that we came up with is called Think and Share. No? So as you can see, we have a very similar icon, and a lot of us here in Ateneo actually use the icon if we want an activity like this. No? So a Think and Share activity usually happens after you present something. So after you present some content, you have a Think and Share activity wherein you ask a provocative question for students to process or make connections between the content and their personal life, or to society, or to something outside in the outside world. So providing opportunities for them to reflect, to extend what they know, helps them process the content. What happens here though is that it slows down the learning. No? And most probably students will say, this takes more time and more effort. No? And I think that's true. And I think that's true. But if you think that this is really helpful, I think we should stand our ground. That more effort, more time doesn't always mean that it doesn't work. No, so it might feel like more work for students, but I think the more work is worth it because asking them to slow down the learning a bit to process what they're looking at, what they're reading, watching, or listening to will go a long way. Another way to connect to content is to have some practice activities. No? So we call these try this out activities that after presenting some content, ask students to do something to exercise or to practice whatever it is that they learned about. No? The screenshot that I'm showing you here is from my current class. One of the things that I like doing in my creativity class is to do a lot of workshops, no? And I really miss doing it in a live scenario. So one of the things that I tried doing this semester is to try asking students to do virtual workshops. So this is an example. So one of the workshops I do is to ask them to select a random object and to think of three to five different ways you will use this object. So for example, this is a pen, but it can be a sword. This is a ruler, but it can be a cutter, so on and so forth. No? So this is something I recently tried out. And what I like about what I think lent itself well here was the ability to post pictures that, as you can see here, my students posted pictures about their individual workshop that they did. And I found that quite helpful, no? That it makes learning a little less lonely because online learning can feel a little lonely. And it gives me concrete sense or documentation of what they were able to do with the skill that I actually taught them. So try this out activities help a lot. In terms of technology, we've also tried to use a couple of tools that help in connecting to content. For example, one of the tools that we've been using is called Perusal. So Perusal is a tool that allows you to do something like this that you see in your screenshot. You can upload the PDF, and when you upload the PDF, you can have conversations about parts of the text. So you could highlight parts of the PDF text, and you could pose a question, a student can reply, and this can be shared to a group of students or to your whole class if you want to have a whole class discussion about a particular text. So it lends itself to an active reading sort of scenario. Another tool that we've been using a lot is called Play Pause It, or some teachers use Edpuzzle. So Play Pause It or Edpuzzle allows you to do something like this. As you can see here on my screenshot, you can have students watch a video, and at certain points in time in the video, it pauses, asks a question. So again, very similar to how we used Play Pause It, how we used Perusal rather. It makes the video watching experience more active and interactive for students. No? But more than that, the questions that you put within the video allow students to connect the content, no? So that they don't just passively consume the content. It's an active experience of thinking about the content, connecting to the content. And maybe just to extend connect to content a little bit, hopefully it's not just about connecting to the content, but when we ask students to connect to the content, one way to further get them connected is to also give opportunities for them to connect to community. No? The first screenshot that you see here is from one of my expectation setting discussion forums last semester. One of my students said that I learn more when I'm with others. No? And this struck me a lot. And this was not the only student who said this. A lot of students said that as they shift to online learning, this might be something that they will miss, no? This interaction with teachers, with students rather, or their classmates. So one of the things that I explicitly did in my class was to make sure that in our synchronous sessions, I set aside some time for some kamustahan activities, and I try to plan for small group discussions as much as possible. No? In Ateneo, we've made it a point to make sure that we do more asynchronous than synchronous learning. Because of many reasons. One of the reasons being internet connectivity, but also because we also know from literature that if we want students to digest information, learn new content, more often than not, asynchronous learning provides more space for that. No? So what we've been encouraging teachers to do and what we've been trying to do ourselves is that in our synchronous situations or synchronous learning situations, for example, in a video conference like this, we try to make sure that it's more about interacting with students than presenting information. And it's more about allowing students to interact among themselves. And a lot of these become absent in most online learning situations. Finally, evaluate to validate. And most probably you're thinking assessment. And I think this is pretty obvious um, and basic for us teachers, right? So how do I see student learning? And I think this is the key question about evaluating to validate. When you teach online or in a distance, how can you see that students are actually learning? So just a few things to share. So first, I've been able to see it a lot in discussion forums. So as you can see, this is one of my favorite tools because it's very flexible. It depends on what you ask them and what you ask them to do. But in discussion forums, as they reply, you begin to see if they're really getting it or not. And when they're not getting it, I think the important thing here is to actually give feedback about what they've shared. No? So for example, the screenshot that you see here on the right, when, under assignment comments, is a situation wherein a student actually gave a comment or a reply to a question I asked. But then when you read his reply, it's quite evident that he did not read the text, no? That it was just his opinion, something that he got from the top of his head. So what I did was I asked him in the comment section of the assignment, when you read Weisberg, what resonated with you the most? No? So I didn't necessarily tell him that, oh, hindi ka nagbasa, no? He didn't read it. Instead, what I did was I put a comment to force him to read it or to prompt him to do the reading. No? So sometimes you'll see this. No? In discussion forums, some students might think that teachers just skim through it. But then, well, of course, if you have a lot of students, you'll probably browse through them. But then I think as teachers, when you browse through the content, one of the things that you would often look out for is, are they really getting it? And when you see that a student doesn't get it, it's a great opportunity for you to sort of prompt them to do something to get them there, or to clarify misconceptions, or to add to whatever it is that needs clarification, or that needs that they think that you think they need to learn a little bit more. Another thing that I do often to evaluate, to validate, is to give practice activities. So you saw one earlier, the find an object activity. This is for my visual thinking class, I think, wherein I ask them to do a lot of different activities to practice their visual thinking. So for example, if you see the screenshot over here, I teach them things like mind mapping, six thinking hats, all of these different strategies. But the goal is not just to teach them what the strategy is, but for them to be able to practice. No? And I wanted to show this screenshot just to overemphasize that when we talk about distance learning or online learning, most especially, it's not always about online activities. No? So as you can see here, it's literally a picture of a piece of paper, and my students actually did the activity offline. No? So when you give students activities for evaluation, maybe this is something just to remind you of, no? That it doesn't always need to be online. It could be offline. In fact, some offline activities are more interesting than the online activities. Another way to evaluate student learning is to make sure that you have situated formative assessments. And I know that there will probably be a speaker who will talk about assessments a little more, but I just wanted to share with you a practice that I have in my modules. So one of the things that I often like doing is to make sure that at the end of the module, I have an exit ticket wherein I ask one or two questions. And just by answering those one or two questions, students get to reflect on what they learned throughout the module. And this is helpful for me because I try to put a lot of activities in my modules, and I know that it will take a lot of time for me to go through them. No? So what I often do is, one of the things that I check the most are these exit tickets, because this gives me a clue about where students are, what they've actually learned so far. So activate from context, correct to content, and evaluate to validate. Again, if you've been listening to the past few things that I've been sharing, a lot of these things sound pretty basic, because I think that the invitation to teach online and the invitation to teach online well, to ace it, is really an invitation to go back to the basics, to go back to what good teaching is, and to try to explicitly make good teaching happen. No? And I think along the way, what's most important is to continue to get feedback from students. So for example, here, I always have a checkpoint halfway through the module just to see where students are, just to see what's actually helping or not. And if you do this often, you'll find that students really become quite open about what's happening in their learning. For example, here a student said that they really found difficulty in this reading because of the language, and they would rather read something that's written more simply. Or, for example, the second student here talked about how the discussion forums help him or her understand the lesson more, because sometimes she wasn't sure about what she was learning, but then when a question was posed in the discussion forum and she was able to answer it, then it validates that she has learned something in the module. Or I also ask about estimated learning time. No? So this is something that is really hard to predict. And so what I do is at the end of the module, I ask students, how much time did you really spend doing the module? And I try to calibrate. I try to see if the estimated learning time that I had in mind, how it fares as compared to the actual learning time. So we won't be able to do this perfectly, no? Because as we plan for things, we plan with a couple of assumptions. And when students actually interact with the things that we plan for, then we bring those assumptions into reality, and we need to calibrate. And it needs to be an ongoing conversation with students. So I'd like to end with just a few key ideas that we're realizing so far about online learning. The first key idea is online learning makes teaching more visible. Um, for if, for example, before in a face-to-face scenario, we can just enter the classroom and wing it and perform, I don't think we can continue to do that anymore in an online setting. When most especially in asynchronous scenarios, wherein when we pre-write modules, when we preconceive and design modules for students to go through, uh, the teaching there is very explicit. And good teaching practices that we bring to an online scenario will continue to be effective. But bad teaching practices that we bring to an online learning scenario um, might become worse, no? Because we're not there to compensate for a lot of these bad practices. But at the same time, the advantage is, I think, online learning makes learning more visible too. And I hope in my examples, I was able to show that one of the advantages, I think, of online learning is that there's more evidence of student learning. Um, if if you ask for the evidence, of course, that's a prerequisite. Uh, and I think the big idea at the end of the day is this, no? There's this Zulu greeting called Sawubona, no? Which means I see you or we see you. So in the Zulu tribe, this is how they greet themselves, greet each other rather. So when they see each other, they say Sawubona. And I think this is the invitation in online learning, in a medium that is seemingly detached, in a medium where one of the major concerns is the distance between the teacher and the student. um, Maybe the big idea or the big question is always, how do we bridge this distance? How do we make sure that we see each other, that the student sees the teacher, and we teachers continue to see each of our students along the way? So thank you very much, and I hope that my sharing has been helpful for you and has helped you think about how to ace designing for learning in your own particular situation.